Hello, it's Mrs. Wallace. I hope all is well on this rainy Saturday. I just wanted to do this video to review a little bit of the source, the one source that you read for homework last week. The source title is Hating America, Bin Laden as a Civilizational Revolutionary. The author is Robert Snyder, who is a college professor of political science at a university in Texas. And this is an essay that was written just a few years after 9/11. So there's a lot of modern context that's not in this piece just because it was authored, in the early 2000s, just a few years after 9/11. For us, this serves as a very distinct kind of source compared to some of the other sources that we looked at in class that were maybe, propaganda written by Osama bin Laden, or maybe a descriptive source by some, organization like Britannica, right, or Choices or something like that. This is a source that's written by an academic, and it's published in a political science journal that's pretty well known for an audience largely of other political scientists. So when academics publish, they're oftentimes making an original argument that's contributing to a debate amongst people in their field. So, in this case, it's political scientists. And so they have an interest in having this debate about, why is it that Al-Qaeda hated America and why is it that 9/11 happened? This particular author is going to pitch an argument into a debate that already exists. And that's helpful for us because we get a sense of this particular argument, what Snyder's argument, and maybe it's a quality argument and maybe it isn't. And there might be reasons why we could evaluate it one way or the other. But we also know that there is debate. So there's a variety of other scholars out there who maybe hold different opinions. And these types of sources become important because they are not necessarily strictly like informational. They are argumentative, but they also have an effect. Some of these different academic pieces that are written by people who describe why 9/11 happened, have an impact on people in the federal government or on other groups of people who are making decisions about what to do in response to 9/11. So it is a different kind of source. We know that he does have some specific language to describe his argument, and you can get a sense of that, from the title, Bin Laden as a civilizational revolutionary. We're going to note that because he's a political scientist, he's really setting up a new category for how can we classify Osama bin Laden and his actions on 9/11? Where do they fit? What's significant about them? And, how can we get into that? And if we wanted to get into some of the main points of this, we can kind of go back to the article itself. So one of the things about this is it's a particularly challenging read, first of all, because it's academic writing, and also because it is, it's long, right? So it taxes our brains. So a couple of things, there's a little abstract on the top, and this is useful because it basically suggests this is what Snyder is going to say. He has a few sentences here. He talks about much of the literature on September 11 focuses on bin Laden as either a terrorist or on, this idea of a clash of civilizations. And so he basically says, people who have already suggested, that bin Laden had, reasons for his behavior, it's either he's a terrorist, he was using violence for some type of political goal, and that's everything that he was about, or this was really kind of a clash of two worldviews, maybe based on religion, and everything to understand about 9/11 is based on this, kind of inevitable clash that maybe goes back in time, right, to some, kind of worldwide clash between religious groups and whatnot. In criticizing both of these ideas, this paper is all about civilizational revolutionary. So the very first part of this we know is going to be kind of definitional. Why does Snyder kind of critique these other views, and why does he ultimately come up with this definition of civilizational revolutionary? What is this about? And he is trying to support that bin Laden is a revolutionary. So that's one part of the definition. Why is he a revolutionary? Because he's tried to topple, moderate regimes in the Middle East. and to reestablish something new, right? That's what revolutionaries do. They kind of kick out one political system and put in something of their own vision. That's something that he's going to argue bin Laden did. And, he is going to do something not using nationalism, not using something like that, like telling everybody that their identity is going to be connected to some sort of national identity. He's emphasizing culture, in which Snyder's going to describe as militant Islamicism. Yes, I have to say that correctly. This idea of a very, very specific version of Islam is going to become, Obama's kind of use of religion and use of trying to build a following and identity. The literature on social revolution suggests he is like most other revolutionaries. He kind of takes this like regional idea, trying to topple these regional moderate states, and makes it a much bigger issue by involving the United States. That's how he's externalizing. And he's also doing some things that are a little bit atypical of revolutionaries. He is evoking this apocalyptic type of terrorism, right? So we get a sense, in this very beginning piece, we get quite a bit of a sense of what, the author is trying to say. The very first, 2 pages of this, and I'm not really going to go through the whole thing. I'm just going to kind of give you some highlights and some things to note. If you look at, the first 2 pages of this, he does kind of get into some definitions, right? There are people who have argued that 9/11 is 100% a clash of civilizations. And he points out in particular Sam Huntington, who basically says, the West is hated because its values conflict with Islamic ones. So this is the West and Islam, versus thing, and that's what it is. And he does kind of concede. Bin Laden at times does try to create a clash of civilizations. He tries to build that to get more followers. So it's kind of got an anti-Western bent to it. But he says, bin Laden doesn't really represent the views of everybody in the Middle East, so, or the Islamic world. So this is not, realistic, right? This whole thing. He says, in fact, there's really, because moderate governments were really his big beef, what he hated was some moderate governments that weren't kind of fundamentalist Islamic enough. He's really got a clash kind of within one civilization. He's trying to commit this revolution. That's what he's trying to do. And the United States is going to get kind of involved in that. So this really isn't all about, Islam versus the West. So he trashes that other argument. And that other argument becomes one that in the years following 9/11 was pretty popular. People evoke like the word, crusade to kind of draw this back to a clash of civilizations that maybe existed historically, and historians kind of say that didn't really exist even historically. So it kind of gets misused as an interpretation. And Snyder's going to be in like that camp. He also basically says, bin Laden has been characterized as a terrorist, maybe like Timothy McVeigh or other people who have used violence, right, to kind of have a political point. He says, he's more than a terrorist, right? He actually has a little bit of some support, maybe not enough to ever make this revolution successful, but he attempts to try to get some support. So, he kind of then classifies this civilizational revolutionary, right? We get it in the piece as something that's in italics right here in the beginning of page 327. So we kind of know, this is overturning the status quo government in nations, but really on a regional basis. And, he argues kind of his really big point that the goal in attacking the US, really has much less to do with just being anti-Western. It's not like he's trying to destroy the US just to destroy the US. He's trying to start a war that's going to polarize Muslims and get maybe the US kind of involved even more so in the Middle East. And this is going to delegitimize, all those political entities that are connected to the United States. And this is what he's talking about with this theory of externalization. He's going to like almost frame this conflict as like U.S. caused by trying to ensure that all of the tensions that exist in the Middle East and why, there maybe is a lack of success in the revolution is because the U.S. is kind of being involved in that. And so he tries to create this version of terrorism for a specific outcome. and that outcome is to unravel and maybe build more support throughout the Middle East in an effort to try to, kind of gain the more anti-Western sense that people will cut that tie and recognize, the U.S. as the instigator of some of the political problems leading to a successful revolution. He does then try to get into some of the things that this paper will do. He does say that there is a kind of a context that matters. So he does describe that, he sees this through a lens like other revolutions, that this is kind of like, other revolutions where there's a struggle between, people who want change in political power and the status quo. He also, on the bottom of page 327, going into page 328, he tells the reader, us, exactly how this paper is going to be broken down. And this is a place where you can like grab your little marker and kind of say, okay, this is, what this is going to be, right? He is basically going to say, this is the first part of this paper right here, looks good to bin Laden. I'm trying to highlight and it's not really working out that well. But the first part of the paper is what were bin Laden's goals as a revolutionary? What makes bin Laden a revolutionary? The second part is going to say that, if people were going to follow him as a legitimate revolutionary, the masses basically needed some potential to rebel and follow him, right? Was there this kind of potential, right? Was there anything amongst the population of the masses that would give them some reason to follow Osama bin Laden, right? Even, just kind of go along with his ideas. And this is where he talks about like anti-Americanism, some of the ways in which U.S. foreign policy has made it so that there's disdain maybe in the region for some American policies, how there could be, in a sense, a little bit of value differences. He argues not because there's an inevitable clash of civilizations, but because in these particular areas of the world, in the Middle East, there might be, effects of globalization. There might be some kind of recipe for differences in cultural values in these revolutionary states. Some of the expectations of what states are going to complete and what they ultimately complete, there might be some aspects of anti-American sense. So the masses might have a little bit of that. And how does then Osama bin Laden kind of exploit the tactics of terrorism? And, how does he kind of involve this like really apocalyptic idea of destroying the United States as a way to kind of build this revolution of sorts, and how, in a sense, that fails this third part. So, we can imagine that the entire paper is really, kind of based on those three parts, and they're labeled, right? So the very first one is, why is bin Laden civilizational and also failed revolutionary, right? So this is where he starts to get into what is a revolution in general, and what is a civilizational revolution. He says, revolutions have a couple of different types of characteristics. They have elites who want to change in government, and they have masses that agree to follow them. So that's something that maybe Osama bin Laden tries. He should be civilizational because he's not doing this on a national level. He's doing this kind of a regional level, and he's defining the region on a kind of a level where he's got maybe an identity for the group of people. He says, we're going to emphasize culture as the basis for this revolution. So people who fit into this particular cultural box, in a sense, become the group that ultimately is going to be tied to this revolution. And they exist in nations, in a variety of nations. So he gives a couple of examples of what is or what isn't civilizational institutions and civilizational revolutions. He suggests that he's dependent on some changes in foreign policy. Here he's talking about the change from like colonial powers like Britain and England to the Cold War, and then when the Soviet Union kind of gets pushed out by the Mujahideen, the United States is kind of in a like one kind of imperial power that's left. So it maybe, is important to understand some of that context in order to get an idea of how Snyder builds his argument. He's talking about bin Laden breaking with the Saudis. He talks about trying to get the United States to leave Somalia. So he does describe kind of the way we looked at the two letters from Osama bin Laden. Snyder also puts his finger on, Al-Qaeda kind of changes, over time. He talks about that 1998 source, the declaration of war on America, about, how this is a problem, that the United States has its military in Saudi Arabia. And, that's a problem, not just because the U.S. should get their military out, but, Saudi Arabia shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't have that relationship with the United States. And ultimately, that's a problem. He also shifts his strategy, and it becomes much more kind of focused on this idea of like Western imperialism. And maybe he sees some of this, Snyder sees some of this change connected to the fact that the revolution hasn't really been successful in Osama bin Laden's eyes. So in a way to try to enable its success, he needs greater following. And so this anti-American sentiment, this is where we might see, Osama bin Laden build a little bit of a clash of civilization, the 1998 and then the 2002 letters are more about like jihad against Jews and crusaders and that type of propaganda language. Christian legions spread like a pest, crowded its land, ate its resources. So this sense of kind of a clash of civilizations, Snyder saying is like part of the argument. It's just not the only thing that's happening. He's doing that because he's trying to get more people in the Middle East behind him. And again, this is an argument, so you can be like, no, I don't know that that's really the case, right? He describes this as civilizational revolution because ultimately what, Osama bin Laden is seeking is some sort of transnational identity along the lines of Islam and the way he sees it, in contrast to Western, infidels, right? So, he kind of goes along with that. And he's got a couple of different examples using the history of Saudi Arabia. He's talking about specific writings that Osama bin Laden had, and how and why he got to this conclusion, right? For a revolution to occur, there needs to be an organized opposition with an alternative vision. And he's talking about examples where there had been times where extremists in Saudi Arabia, like himself, come into conflict, with other leaders, in Saudi Arabia. And he ultimately gets ousted from Saudi Arabia. So we know that Osama bin Laden has that particular experience. And, for the large part, this militant Islam becomes unpopular. They are not gaining in popularity, rather moderate Islamists are. And so, that's kind of where Snyder goes with some of these examples. And so some of the changes of Osama bin Laden by 2001 is, reacting to some of these like kind of context changes. The second part of the paper is all called the basis of anti-Americanism. Where does that sentiment come from? And this is where Snyder says, although he attempted to foment a clash of civilizations, the fact that he does to do this to basically undermine secular or moderate status quo governments within the region, talks about this really being a big clash within the Islamic world. So Snyder's saying, this isn't 100% happening because of anti-Americanism, but he does take advantage of anti-Americanism and try to polarize, and radicalize groups of Muslim. And, where does some of this, anti-Americanism, happen? He goes into a lot of detail here, about U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. He uses a lot of examples here that are important to get across. The U.S., power in the region increased, and in a lot of cases that increase in power leads to diplomatic problems and The United States, gets resented by much of the world, for example, for its support of Israel. So he talks about, this peace process and how the United States was involved in trying to set up greater peace, but there really was never an establishment of a Palestinian state. So perhaps there's still resentment, amongst some Arab regimes, for that lack of Palestinian statehood. So he is kind of going into some of the historical context about, where would any animosity toward the West, stem from. There is a whole bunch of reasons why that might happen. He also talks about how the war in Iraq in the early 1990s, not the war in Iraq that happens as a result of 9/11, but in the early 1990s, Kuwait, which is predominantly Muslim, gets attacked by the country of Iraq, and the United States comes to the aid of Kuwait, and it lends itself to a lot of sanctions and other foreign policy actions against Iraq, has a huge impact on lots and lots of people. He talks about the outcome of that. He also describes the role of oil in the Middle East as something that's kind of a modern phenomenon. The country of Saudi Arabia is like relatively new, kind of before World War II, and the rise of Saudi Arabia as an oil owning society that controls a great deal of oil, along with some other societies in the Middle East. That kind of becomes a much more like 1960s 1970s thing. So the way that oil and the wealth attached to oil affect the Middle East, he kind of gets into some of that. Some of this is about the economy and the wealth. Some of this is also about who gets that wealth and who doesn't get that wealth, and the way in which sometimes that wealth can blind a lot of what's happening economically. There may be, kind of challenges that have come from, extraction of resources, war. This impact of oil, is part of the context of understanding why maybe people don't like, the United States. This internationalization of oil maybe becomes very represented by the United States. There's also a great way in which globalization as a whole maybe doesn't necessarily benefit some Arab societies equally as Western societies. And maybe that's part of this, also. So he kind of gives a whole bunch of examples of where there might be some particular value differences. Unlike saying that this is just a blanket clash of civilizations, he kind of says that there is a kind of version of globalization that promotes like certain these kind of modern ideas, whether it's democracy or it's materialism or things like that, that maybe there's some contradictions, right, in the realm of Islam with some of these like effects of globalization, some of the modern idea, and where that comes from. And this is where, he's talking about, societies that maybe kind of have been trying to connect to a world that is increasingly globalizing, but yet still are trying to maintain some significant traditions that kind of ultimately conflict with some of the new modern ideas. There becomes a vacuum of sorts, and this becomes connected to Americanism or Westernism. In other words, maybe there is a society, there's kind of a mismatch in a sense, like a society that at the top, is dependent on the U.S. exclusively for benefits that might go to, particular groups like, oil, recipients of oil wealth, and doesn't necessarily have like democratic values. There becomes kind of a mismatch between the relationship between the United States and some of what might be the freedoms that the United States offer. Some of those, there's like a mismatch in what types of things might be politically received by certain societies of what Americanism is all about, right? Just kind of Americanism coming through in the form of, petrodollars and, lots and lots of ways that maybe there's a movement, and people questioning, Americanism, right? And so there's a bunch of discuss about that. And, he gets to some of the reasons that, militant Islamists globalization in a sense, in this like American way, strikes at the core of their identity. Secularism is godless, but it's also seen as civilizational, and being thrust upon them. So in a sense, it justifies some degree of violence because, it is a difference. And this is part of the propaganda that Osama bin Laden, kind of creates. He creates like a revolutionary antithesis to secularism, based on this like broader version of what that might mean, using particular happenings in predominantly Muslim societies to kind of build that. Okay, I don't know if that is probably a confusing, but the argument, you can kind of look back and get some ideas of what he is trying to say. There's some context pieces that make it more likely for this revolution to have some following, is basically what he's suggesting. And then, of course, it doesn't work. There is not a following because the externalization, what happens in the use of terrorism. So this revolution kind of creates terrorism as a model, basically mass military mobilization, this violent external conflict. He gets into discussing that the externalization process becomes, problematic in a sense, and also embedded in what his goal is. He describes an example of externalization in a prior event, the Iranian Revolution, which happens in the late 1970s. In this revolution, there is a way that the United States, like even as early as the 50s, was trying to install Western-friendly governments that would, work with the West on oil deals and things like that. And the Shah of Iran was a particular political voice that was in power in 1979. And this had been the case since the 1950s, since a U.S.-led coup kind of installed this political power, very Western, pro-Western friendly, all the way until 1979. There is a revolution to overturn the Shah of Iran. When that happens, the revolution isn't necessarily initially anti-American. It's anti the Shah, anti this political leader. It's a revolution. But then what happens is there is a group of students that storm the U.S. Embassy, and they do this because the United States has taken the Shah in for medical treatment. So there's this perception that the United States is going to protect the Shah, not let the Shah be killed in this revolution, and maybe even reinstall the Shah. And the embassy takeover has over 100 hostages that are American, and they're all diplomats, and they're held in captivity for about a year. And in the United States, this is during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. This lends itself to a huge political crisis, and this creates really bad diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran. So this becomes an example of externalization, where this particular kind of domestic issue with trying to replace a government at home gets very connected to a role of the United States as kind of this proxy state. And, revolutionary Islam kind of sees this, and, the revolution is successful. There is an Islamic government that's put in place, which is still politically in power. The United States hasn't had a good relationship with with Iran since, and there is, in a sense, that the United States is kind of seen as problematic in this relationship. So we're going to see Snyder kind of suggests that Osama bin Laden is after the same type of clash of civilizations, trying to kind of use the United States as a target to try to illegitimize the U.S. role, in the Middle East, thinking. And this is where Snyder gets very hypothetical, where a lot of people might clearly disagree with him. He kind of says, this whole notion of jihad to bin Laden is really a theory of revolution, that this war with the West is going to purify, the Middle East. That's something bin Laden believes. And, that maybe in order to sustain a revolution, there would have to be, and he kind of says bin Laden probably calculated maybe the United States was going to get into a guerrilla war in Afghanistan, just like, the Soviet Union did. maybe he figured that the United States would flee Afghanistan a lot earlier, and there wouldn't be a lot of big deal over it, and then maybe people would be ticked off at the United States, and Muslims would rally behind the Islamists, that Osama bin Laden would come out, in a sense, with a greater, ability to lead a revolution. And, we get a sense in this third part, how this also fails, because, the terrorism, of course, becomes, the problem, right? Nobody who was was originally maybe interested in, kind of looking at a world through a lens of anti-Americanism. Now, terrorism has led to the deaths of, 3,000 people, and it doesn't solicit any response. In fact, it challenges, anybody's, following of Osama bin Laden becomes very rooted in the notion that terrorism then is acceptable, right? So, that's where this kind of ends. And he really, it tries to become revolutionary in this like new way by employing terrorism, and it completely doesn't get successful. But in the couple of years after, 9/11, this author is also suggesting, how does the U.S. kind of deal with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, because he's still present, as a terrorist, in the international community. So some of the end of the essay, talks about how this apocalyptic, terrorism, and what, it was trying to do, and what could happen in the future. So I hope that was a little helpful. I know it was like a lot of me going on and on and on, which is why I made this optional. But I did want to give you a little bit of a sense of how you could take this like really, really long piece, probably break it up and look at those, beginning pieces as definitional, kind of setting up the argument, and then, parts 1, 2, and 3, which have headings in bold that kind of speak to the major claims that get made by Snyder, and like where and how he tries to use evidence and cite some other people. Again, this essay ends up getting to be part of the analysis in the 9/11 Commission that talks about why 9/11 happened. And it also gets published in reference to 9/11 in a lot of college and high school textbooks. So this particular essay poses a thesis that becomes fairly commonplace among scholars. That's one of the reasons for looking at it, just to kind of see where some of that argumentation comes from, and where we can maybe see it unfold. Okay, be well. Again, this was optional. I hope you have a great weekend.